Okay, we go again. Um, Let me know if you can see and hear me, please. That would be great. Sorry to keep you waiting. Um, Hello? Let me know. All right. Hopefully, good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, Carolyn. Yes. Okay, that's good. Thanks for bearing with me. A few technical hitches, just a quick explanation. I was all set to go, press the record button at 11 o'clock, only to be told that Chrome, my version of Chrome, no longer supported the camera function software on Facebook. So I had to rush off and download Firefox, which is what we're doing here. So if anyone else is doing any live streaming, you should know that you either need a beta version of Chrome or Firefox, because I also found that Safari, that's Mac's Apple's own browser, also is not supported either. So there we are. So anyway, that's over with. A little bit later than starting, 11:15, but we shall go. So today we're having from, obviously, can you see that? Yes, Wisdom of the Zen Masters, our regular text. And today we have an extract from the third Zen patriarch, or the third Chinese patriarch, who is called Master Sosan. The third patriarch says, "Do not be attached to either the one or the other. Do not search for them. If one clings to right and wrong, even to the least extent, his heart gets lost in the tangle. Both exist only through the one, but do not cling even to the one. If no attached thinking arises, then there is no error in things." So just to remind everybody, those who might not be so familiar with the history of Buddhism and the history of Zen, obviously Buddhism, the Buddha was lived and died in India. Obviously, he was born on the border of India and Nepal in the sort of northeastern territories. And after that, Buddhism began to travel, obviously travel throughout the whole of India, particularly in the north. But then it also travelled east into China and north into Tibet as well. And according to the legend, it was Bodhidharma who brought the spirit of Buddhism to China. And he's known as the first Zen patriarch and the first Chinese patriarch. After him, there came Eka, who was his disciple, and then after him came Sosan. And it's Sosan who is whose quote we are looking at today. Perhaps the other claim to fame for Sosan, as far as Chinese Buddhism is concerned, is that he penned a long poem called On Faith in the Heart, which has been translated a few times and has appeared in the Buddhist Society's journal, The Middle Way. And the opening couplet of that poem goes like this: "The great way is not difficult. It merely avoids picking and choosing." And that picking and choosing is intimately connected with what the third patriarch is saying here when he says, "Do not be attached to either the one or the other." So what does he mean? Going back to that poem, what does Sosan mean when he says the great way is not difficult, it merely avoids picking and choosing? Well, first of all, the great way is a translation of Mahayana, and obviously refers to Mahayana Buddhism, of which Zen is a school of Mahayana Buddhism. And the Great Way refers to the Buddha's teaching that leads all beings to Buddhahood, that leads all beings to the same enlightenment that the Buddha himself attained when he sat under the Bodhi tree. And on the morning of the 8th of December, looked up into that clear morning sky, saw the morning star, and awoke and became the Buddha. And the Buddha prophesied that all beings would eventually attain to Buddhahood. And this path to Buddhahood is known as the Great Way, the Mahayana. So the third patriarch said that before, the The Great Way is not difficult, it merely avoids picking and choosing. So what does he mean by that? Well, he's talking about the fact that the human heart itself, in its natural state, is empty. It's what's called Mushin, the empty heart. And the classic story of this really is, I suppose, about the master with the new student who asks the master to teach him, and they're sat down having tea. And the master doesn't say anything, he merely starts pouring tea into the student's cup. And the cup very quickly fills up, and the master doesn't stop pouring, he keeps pouring. And so the tea begins to flow over the top and onto the table. And the student responds, "Master, master, the cup is full, no more can go in." And the master stops at that point and says, "And so it is with you and your mind and your heart. If your mind and heart are full, and full of attachments to ideas and notions, etc., then there will be no room for anything that I can teach you. First, you have to empty that cup out." And so when we practice meditation, for example, when we sit down and either follow the breath or follow the count on the breath, what we are doing is we're relaxing the mind and we're relaxing the heart, and allowing it to become decluttered. And a lot of people get a bit of a fixation about this because people think that somehow now I must make my mind blank. But this is where we go wrong. We think that the opposite of fullness is blankness, but actually the opposite of fullness is emptiness. And emptiness is something else. If we go back to that notion of the cup and that cup full of tea, actually what makes a cup useful is the space that it contains within it. That it turns it into a vessel. So it's that space that is useful. The thing is, even when there is tea in that cup, the space is still there. It may be occupied, but in fact that space is always there. And so it is with our mind as well. Whether our mind is obsessed or whether it's quiescent, the emptiness of mind or the emptiness of heart is always there. And meditation is simply a practice that allows us to return to that spaciousness. This is why when we talk about practice, when we talk about the practice of Zazen or sitting meditation, we often refer to what's called the quiet spaciousness that arises out of this practice of emptying the heart. And the idea is that, during the day, obviously, we become preoccupied with things. But every so often, we just keep returning back. We just keep returning back to that quiet spaciousness that has become now familiar through the practice of sitting meditation. So when the third patriarch refers to avoiding picking and choosing, what he's referring to is not becoming attached to the tea in the teacup, basically, if we want to continue using our metaphor. Instead of becoming fixated on the tea, just remember the space, just recall and come back to the space that the tea at this moment is occupying. So whether the cup is full or whether it's empty, that space is always there. And whether the mind is or heart is full or empty, actually that spaciousness is also there as well. And it's the ability to be able to declutch and return to it. So what happens when we start picking and choosing is that we become attached to things. So what the third patriarch is referring to here is this tendency to allow the contents of the heart to become too important. We begin to invest our identity in it, or I begin to invest myself into it. I put a lot of emotional energy into it. And so when something threatens one of my preferences, something that I like, for example, I react to it. And when I do that, then we lose sight of the emptiness of the heart. It becomes the whole thing. It's rather like, for example, we've all been carried away by something, by a desire. We've all, say particularly at home now, it's very easy, we get a bit bored. I don't like that boredom. And that's the attachment. that not liking the feeling of being bored. That's where the attachment lies. So suddenly I become obsessed with the idea of escaping from that boredom. So what shall I do? Well, I've watched TV, there's nothing on TV. I know what I'll do. I'll do some online shopping. And so I just start doing some online shopping, and I end up buying things that, you know, I don't really need. And they come, and then maybe I send them back afterwards. And I think, oh, you know, I'm always doing that sort of thing. I really should get out of the habit of it. But, you know, the boredom comes back again another time, and I go back to that online shopping because it makes me feel good. Buying something for myself makes me feel a little bit special. When we are doing that, when we are falling into that behavior, that becomes the whole of our world. And this is what the passions do. They narrow down the focus, they narrow down the perspective. And in so doing, we lose sight of the emptiness of mind or the emptiness of heart. We lose sight of that Mushin. And if we don't go back to it, then our desires just begin to take us over. And this is what leads us away from the Great Way. This is what leads us back into suffering and obviously away from the nature of mind, the nature of the heart, what's known as the true nature in Zen. And in so doing, we lose sight of that Great Way. Hence, this is what the third Patriarch meant when he said, the Great Way is not difficult, it merely avoids picking and choosing. So here the tack is slightly different, where he says, do not be attached either to the one or the other. Do not search for them. So that one or the other is the picking and choosing, preferring this over that or that over this. Because obviously if I have become attached to this, then I don't want that. I don't want its opposite. That's just simple logic. Do not search for them. In other words, do not yearn for them. Do not grasp after them. If one clings to right or wrong, even to the least extent, his heart gets lost in the tangle. And we may be quite shocked by that. The idea, well, you know, right and wrong are important. Is Zen, is Mahayana, saying that we should ignore right and wrong, that right now, you know, I have an empty heart and so I shall go and rob a bank or something like that. Well, obviously the answer to that is no, because we still have our precepts, which are our 5 basic ethical injunctions: not to cause harm, not to steal, not to cause sexual harm, not to use false speech, and to refrain from intoxication. So the Buddha's way, the Great Way, cannot truly deviate from that and still call itself the Buddha's way, because these were the precepts laid down by the Buddha himself. So obviously it doesn't mean that we go and do what we like, but we know, looking at our own history, and certainly looking at religious history and also political history, that some of the worst atrocities have been carried out in the name of the right and the good and how things ought to be. Because, of course, the way that what I think is proper and what I think is right and what I think we should do may not be the same as your way. But if I'm really attached to, if I'm absolutely convinced that my way is the proper way, and you disagree with me, then you must be Satan. And we know that sort of behaviour leads to the stake, or to the atrocities, to the massacres, and so on and so forth. This is the contempt that very easily creeps in. And of course, the problem with the good is that the means begin to justify the end. And so it begins to allow some of the darkest fantasies, some of the darkest impulses in the human heart. Normally they are restrained because we know they're not proper, but they can be unleashed in the pursuit of the good. And this is a point that's made a lot of in Zen, and there are all sorts of stories about it. The one that comes to mind, of course, is Master Tanka. So Master Tanka was a very great Zen master, and he was on pilgrimage, and one winter's day he came to a rather poor remote temple and asked for lodgings, which he was granted. And the incumbent priest who was there, Master Tanka, realized quite quickly that this man had a particular righteousness about him, and so devised a skillful means. The incumbent had prepared a small little fire with a couple of sticks on it, hardly enough to keep warm. And when the incumbent priest left to go and make his guest a cup of tea, Master Tanka climbed up onto the shrine, picked up one of the wooden Buddhas, and put it on the fire. So by the time that the incumbent priest came back, the wooden statue had caught alight and was burning merrily away and throwing out a good heat and a good light. But he was horrified. He said, "What are you doing? You are burning the Buddha." And Master Tanka, sort of poking around in the ashes, says, "Oh," he says, and will the sharira, will we find any sharira in here? According to tradition, when a saint or a Buddha is cremated, it's said that you find little jewels called sharira in the ashes, and this confirms their holiness. So this is what he meant. Oh, if we're burning the Buddha, do you think we'll find some of the holy jewels in the ashes? And the incumbent said, "No, of course not. It's made of wood." "Oh, well then," said Master Tanka, in that case, why don't you get another one? It is rather chilly." So there were lots of stories, along these lines, and these were often told, in the sort of Zen milieu in China and Japan and so forth. But of course, we hear these sorts of things. Buddha doesn't really mean that much to us. And so we sort of think, oh, well, we quite like that sort of iconoclasm. But we have to remember that these stories were being told to monks and nuns who had spent their whole life devoted to the Buddha. And they were probably the children of Buddhist priests. They had been brought up revering the Buddha. They then went to the monastery where it became even more intense. Their whole life was Buddhism, Buddhism, Buddha, 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 and the teachings. To suddenly be confronted with that, where your highest ideal is dropped onto a fire. Or when Master Umon, when he was asked, "What is Buddha?" and he replied, "A shit stick," just meaning a piece of poo. To be told something like that about your highest ideal is no laughing matter. But what they're looking for with these stories, they're looking to see, is there an attachment? Because even if there's an attachment to Buddha, then it can turn poisonous. And there's that rather nice story in the 50s when two American Buddhists who were interested in Zen went over to Japan. And they sort of turned up at a small temple, and there they asked the priest if he could show them around. Now, these Americans, rather like a lot of Western Zen practitioners at that time, had been brought up on these stories of, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha, and on shit stick, and Master Tanka burning the Buddha, and all this sorts of stuff. And this was cool, So when they came to this temple, this was an ordinary Zen priest, no great Zen master or anything. He showed them round, and you start off in the shrine room, and he said, "This is where we chant in the morning." And he put his hands together and he bowed to the Buddha, as on the threshold, of course. And then he said, "And this is the Zendo, where we sit meditation." And he bowed to the statue of Manjushri Bodhisattva that was standing there, as he always did when he entered. "And this is the kitchen, and there's a little Bodhisattva, because there is." And he just put his hands together as he walked past it. And then this is the community room, the same thing, and this is the ablution room. And even there was a little Buddha sitting, and just quite naturally, as he always did, he just put his hands together in gassho and inclined his head. And one of the Americans who'd been brought up in this sort of, kill the Buddha type thing, couldn't contain himself anymore. And he said, "Why are you bowing and scraping to all these images? I thought as a Zen Buddhist you were supposed to be above all that sort of thing." "Why, to be perfectly honest," he said, "I could spit at them." Now just think, here these two foreigners had sort of turned up, they'd asked to be shown around, and there they were saying that they could spit, or he could spit, at something that was the most revered thing in your life, the Buddha. And the Japanese priest, in his broken English, simply said, "Okay," he says, "you spits, I bows." Now that shows somebody where that training really has been thorough, that heart truly is empty, it is not caught out by that sort of thing. But the American was attached to his idea of what Zen was. He was shocked because his idea wasn't being borne out in truth, in practice. When he'd gone to Japan, he had read all those books, he created this fantastic image and picture and fantasy of what Zen was. He went to Japan and found that it wasn't like that at all, and then became angry and upset about it. And this is why Buddhism and the Buddha said in those Four Noble Truths that the cause of suffering is craving. And more specifically, the Buddha said of that second noble truth, which is the cause of suffering, is clinging attachment or craving. He said, not getting what I want is suffering. Getting what I don't want is suffering. Being separated from what I like is suffering. Being conjoined with what I do not like is suffering. And so the Buddha made it very clear that actually it's the attitude we take towards things that also creates our suffering. Now we have to be quite careful, because having heard that, if we sort of think, okay, so the Buddha said that non-attachment, non-attachment, non-attachment. And so, I get out and I walk down the street, and I see an old lady fall in front of a bus, and I just think non-attachment. Don't go to her help. That's just her karma, and off I go. That would be inhuman, and of course Buddhism is full of compassion and full of metta, or goodwill, sometimes called loving kindness, but just goodwill, and it has a great emphasis on being of service for the benefit of all beings. It has that deep sense of the value of relationship. So the warmth of heart is front and center as much as the enlightenment in Buddhism. So absolutely no way does the Buddha mean disinterested. So non-attachment is not about being detached. It's not about feeling myself separate or above or beyond the human condition. In fact, quite the reverse. And this is why in the Mahayana there are what are called the Bodhisattva vows. The Bodhisattvas are beings who are so moved by the plight of humanity and are so full of compassion, that suffering with, that they feel moved to be of assistance to all sentient beings and refuse to enter nirvana themselves until all beings have also entered into it as well. So this is it's important to really make that distinction between between sort of detachment and non-attachment, and it's easy to fall into it. It's easy to fall into it. I mean, Jung's story of his friend, the Lutheran pastor, who, in his own words, as he became more and more took on that mantle of the sort of upright member of the church, became more and more cold, more and more reserved, more and more sort of distant, more and more sort of serious, and against anything that might appear frivolous. Until one night, his wife was woken up by him sitting bolt upright in bed next to her, laughing his head off and saying, well, 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 after all, I'm nothing but an old scoundrel, and then proceeded to live it up, which psychologically would certainly balance him out, but it certainly would make him very difficult to live with. And maybe we don't need to go to such one extreme in order to be catapulted into the other. Maybe it's better to have a middle way between that. There is the warmth of heart. There is the recognition that this is wholesome. These things are wholesome, and those things are not. But if we come up against what is unwholesome, there's no reason to make it evil. There's no need to call it satanic. This is why in Buddhism the concept of evil, as we understand it in the Christian sense, does not exist. We have skillful and unskillful. We have wholesome and unwholesome. And it may sound rather wishy-washy sometimes, but it's not. Again, Buddhism can be extremely vigorous against it, but it's simply not about allowing oneself to become angry with it. Why? because this anger can become a curse. It can eat one's heart from the inside. And again, if we look at history or we just look in the papers, what happens when that sort of mentality, particularly with the good, particularly with my cause being good, allows us to do all sorts of things that are, without a shadow, very unwholesome. Just perhaps to finish off with this, with this. So do not search for them, the one or the other. If one clings to right or wrong, even to the least extent, his heart gets lost in the tangle. Both exist only through the one. In other words, the one nature it refers to. But do not cling even to the one, he warns. If no attached thinking arises, there is no error in things. In other words, that the things are just as they are. And yes, this is the difference between, an erupting volcano. If you live far enough away, an erupting volcano is simply a force of nature. But if your house is at the foot of that volcano, then it becomes an angry god. It depends on our attitude towards it. It depends how it impacts on me, on us personally, these things. And to recognize that these perspectives are very different. And it's only if we identify with the one perspective, if we say, well, this is it, and we lose sight of the fact that actually that perspective is made up of a whole cluster of the situation and what's called karma and dharma, basically, and that's what makes the difference. And I remember, just to sort of finish off with, the back in the early days, the very first Zen retreat I went on, and this was actually up in Throstle Hole in Northumbria, and it was like a weekend retreat, weekend session. And I remember on the Saturday evening, one of the nuns, she brought through a tea tray. There's about half a dozen of us on this retreat, half a dozen lay people, that is. And she just put the tray down and she said, "Help yourselves." And I was nearest the tea tray, so I picked up the teapot and I poured myself a cup of tea. And I realised, this being Britain, that people had formed a queue behind me. And I sort of turned round and I suddenly thought, oh, perhaps I shouldn't serve myself first. So I just said to the person behind me, "Would you like milk?" And they said, "Yes." Put some milk in. "Sugar?" "No." And gave it to them. And then, of course, the next person was there. So I poured another cup of tea. "Milk?" "No." "Sugar?" "No." There you go. And I got sort of 3 down the line when the nun came back, saw what was happening, just came over to me, touched my elbow and said, "No, no," she said, "just serve yourself and let everybody serve, and then move on, so that everybody can serve themselves." And of course, I said, "Oh yes," but actually inside I was seething, and I thought to myself, but I was only trying to help. But of course, that wasn't true. Actually, I was trying to be good. I was trying to be seen to be good. I thought this is what a good Buddhist should do. Not think about himself first, pour everybody else's tea. But in so doing, I was talking to everybody and I was making them talk to me. And this was a silent retreat, by the way. So it was going against the nature of the situation. It was going against the rules of the retreat and thus breaking them. Maybe, in a small way, but still it was doing that. And it came to me later that that was actually quite a good example of where the good can lead astray. When I want to be good, the heart I don't see, and I don't see clearly anymore. In that moment, I didn't see that it was breaking the rules of the retreat. Do we see that? It was only afterwards, once I'd got over that, and the thing that betrayed it, of course, was that I was upset, because whenever I don't get my way, I become upset. That is the suffering. That is what the Buddha called dukkha. That's what he meant when he said, when I'm separated from what I want, which is to be good, and conjoined with what I don't want, which is to become upset. That is suffering. And that's hopefully is a clear example of that. So perhaps something to ponder on a little bit. When we sit down in Zazen, even thinking about good and bad Zazen, even getting worked up about, oh, whether this is a good sitting or not a good sitting, this is just further clutter, further tea in the teacup that needs to be emptied out, so that the heart is truly empty. And when the heart is truly empty, actually, it's not that there's nothing. This is always the mistake of I always think that without me, nothing can happen. Without me, no proper choices can be made. But this is not true. This is absolutely not true. And if we want evidence of this, it is all around us. This, according to astrophysicists, this universe in which we live is just under 14 billion years old at the last count. It never had a blueprint. It never wanted anything. It simply lived out of its own nature, and it has produced everything that is in existence, including us as human beings. There's a saying, there's an old Japanese saying. The Japanese are very fond of their flowering cherry blossoms, as you know, in spring. It's a major event. But the saying says, deep in the forest, away from prying eyes, the cherry tree blossoms out of the fullness of its own heart, or out of the sincerity of its own nature. It doesn't do it to be good. It doesn't do it to be admired. It doesn't do it to be thought for some kind of status. And it doesn't do it to be pollinated either. That's the thing. And yet, and this is the mystery now, the mystery is that pollinating insects come and pollinate. Pollinating insects and cherry blossom arise together because they're all part of the Dharma, they're all part of the Tao. And whereas in the Western view, that's seen as a universe that is lifeless, actually it's quite the opposite. And it's certainly the opposite in Chinese thought and Chinese Buddhism. This is a mystery, and it's recognized that at the heart of our universe there is a mystery, and this mystery is a living mystery as well. And this mystery is also in our own heart too. And when the heart is emptied out, then that mystery can function unalloyed. It can function unobstructed by my wants and my graspings in that sort of partial and somewhat blind way. And this is why Master Sosan says the great way is not difficult. It merely avoids picking and choosing. Okay, well, we'll leave that there for today. And if anybody has any last minute questions or anything. Good morning to everybody. Everybody's saying good morning. Then, as I said last week, if you have a question, then on the Zen Gateway, we're always very keen to answer them if we can. So if you think of something that you want to ask, or you want to know a little bit more about Zen practice, daily life practice, or Zazen, then you can always write to me at the Zen Gateway at gmail.com, the Zen Gateway at gmail.com. And we do a monthly podcast, and we will feature those questions and do our best to supply an answer for you. All right, in the meantime, hopefully all being well, now we've solved this problem, I'll be back next Tuesday, 11 o'clock, with another extract from the Wisdom of the Zen Masters. In the meantime, stay safe and well, and yes, stay sane as well. Okay, thanks very much, and goodbye.